Hello, and welcome to Anime Audio Commentary. Today I'll be commenting over episode 24 of Cowboy Bebop. If you'd like to watch along, start watching now. Alright, so based off of the preview from last time, it seemed to me like this episode was going to get pretty somber. And already we're starting off on a note that makes me feel kind of somber because we have Faye watching that Betamax tape. And she looks like she's really scrutinizing it. So Faye is poring over this one scene from the tape, and it almost seems like Ed recognizes the place from the tape. So the Bebop has made planet fall somewhere. It sounds like they've made it to Earth despite having previously been bound for Mars. So Jet doesn't really know what's going on and how they ended up on Earth, but Spike is aware that Faye and Ed have gone off somewhere. Faye makes Ed a big promise that if Ed can guide Faye to the waterfall, she'll give her something really great. So clearly it has some sort of sentimental value to Faye that we, the audience, are not yet aware of. So while Faye and Ed are gallivanting around, we start to focus on a pair of other people. And they appear to be interested in a meteorite that just fell to Earth for reasons unknown. So Ed doesn't seem to be taking things too seriously, much to Faye's annoyance. But funnily enough, there are a bunch of children who seem to recognize Ed. So all these kids are kind of eccentric in the same way that Ed is. So the children are sort of herded by a nun. And it seems like the nun's in charge of a sort of run-down abbey. Ed used to live here a couple years ago, wandered off to presumably where the Bebop crew found her. It seems to be that this nun runs an orphanage of sorts. So Ed displays a rare moment of cunning in that she intentionally misdirected Faye towards the orphanage because Ed knew there would be food. So the plot thickens a little bit. The nun has a sort of holographic picture of Ed's father for Ed, and furthermore, he came looking for Ed about 2 months back. And this happens to be the same man who was chasing the asteroid before. So, true to her word, Ed ends up guiding Faye where she encounters a classmate, or a former classmate. So, Sally, the old woman, says something rather interesting that she thought Faye was a ghost because ghosts appear in places where they have regrets. And I think that sort of cuts to the core of the issue. Faye's classmate even has a young granddaughter, and it creates an air of tension between Faye and the others. She tries to play it off, but it's there. So meanwhile, back on the Bebop, Jed is clearly unhappy, but nothing he says manages to get a rise out of Faye, which is sort of enough to get him to stop. Faye is unusually sullen, although I admit I probably wouldn't be feeling too hot myself if I were in her situation. So the plot thickens further. It turns out there's a pretty big bounty on the head of Ed's father. Obviously, this creates a huge conflict of interest, although nobody's really aware of it at this point. So Ed's father is clearly an eccentric man. That's probably where Ed gets it from. But if nothing else, he seems earnest. So we have a sort of, I guess, a flashback scene. It almost seems like Faye's finally remembering her past. And everything's almost in like a sort of, not a sepia tone, but it's the color palette's very muted, and it sort of shows, I guess, the accident that put her in cryo sleep in the first place seemed like some sort of accident in space. So we have an interaction here between Faye and Spike that's very unusual. Faye's not at all acting like herself, and Spike can tell. That's almost assuredly an ill omen. So Faye and Ed have a small exchange about how Faye finally remembers where she belongs. Ed has somewhere she belongs, and that belonging is the best thing there is. And in my mind, this is this is the pulling of the thread that starts to unravel the whole cloth. Because when you think about it, maybe Ed and Faye have a place where they belong, and maybe Jet does too. But when you get down to it, Spike doesn't really have that. So there's no good end. So Jet and Spike confront Ed's father, and they sort of find out about the Sisyphean task he is undertaking, which is that he's remapping the Earth despite the near continuous asteroid showers that deform the landscape. So, this is unusual because Spike is trying to put the hurt on him, and this guy is just completely no selling him. It's not often that Spike meets a match in hand to hand combat. So their fight is interrupted only by Ed very nearly crashing the Bebop right down on top of them. So Spike and Jet can really only watch in stunned silence. So it seems like everything might have been a misunderstanding after all. The bounty on Ed's father was only 50 Wulongs, and it might have been input by Ed in the first place. So we've come to another crossroads. Ed's father is racing off after another meteorite strike, and Ed is greatly distressed by that. So now there's a choice. Does Ed stay with the crew of the Bebop, or does Ed go with her father? Meanwhile, Faye starts walking through the ruined streets that she remembers from being a child. And there's sort of these parallel shots of flashback and current day. She is racing towards what she remembered to be a house, but when she arrives there, it's just a vacant lot. So we have a rare sequence where there's music with lyrics and no audio. And while all this is going on, Ian appears to be torn as well. Between following Ed and staying on the Bebop, Jet goes to tell everyone that dinner's ready, but nobody's there. And indeed, only Spike is left on the Bebop. Ed has left a goodbye note on the bridge. While all that's going on, Faye's sort of scratched a bunch of lines in the ground in the ruins of what must have been her house. I guess to sort of map out the floor plan that it used to have when she knew it. So ultimately, Ein decides to go with Ed. So Ed continues off in search of her father with Ein in tow. So the crew of the Bebop is down to 3. Oh boy. This episode always gets me. But it's a good pain. You know, if I didn't like Cowboy Bebop so much, it wouldn't hurt it like it does. So, this next episode is truly the beginning of the end. Alright, well, that's all for this episode. If you've enjoyed it, then by all means, stick around for the next episode The Real Folk Blues Part 1.